My name's Adam Cox. I'm the Managing Director of the Relations Group and also founder of Radio Relations, the UK's radio PR specialists. Today, the latest Rajar figures have been released. Rajar, for those that don't know, stands for the Radio Joint Audience Research, a body co-funded by the BBC and the commercial radio industry to ensure consistent measurement of audience figures. And the research has come out today, and I'm going to be taking you through some of the more interesting or relevant key findings. When it comes to the Rajar figures, it's not just the national brands and the London stations that we need to focus on. Although many PR agencies are based in London, actually a vast majority of listeners actually come from local radio stations. So it's really important to see what's happening in the world of local radio. Rajar figures come out once a quarter, and the headlines tend to be attracted by those national breakfast shows, the national radio stations and those big London stations. However, we shouldn't neglect the local radio stations, because a lot of people actually will tune in to their local radio stations even though they can also access better funded, more high profile London or national networks. So we really need to also pay attention to what's been happening in terms of the Rajar audience figures in the world of local radio. In Scotland, Heart in Scotland has actually dropped audience figures, and it's actually had the lowest figures ever since the station was originally founded under its original name, Scot FM. Also in Scotland, Capital Scotland has lost about 30,000 audience reach since the last Rajar figures were measured. While several radio stations in Scotland have actually lost audience reach, and they include Original 106, Smooth Scotland, and many others, actually Moray Firth has actually increased audience reach by almost 10%. In Liverpool, the global decision to rebrand Juice to Capital Liverpool hasn't paid off. As a result of the rebrand and the months that's followed, they've actually had an audience drop. Also in Liverpool, whereas BBC Radio Merseyside has remained pretty much the same in terms of their audience reach, the Radio City brands have all had a either slight or significant increase in their audience reach. In Manchester, Key 103 has actually increased audience from about 30,000 additional listeners, whereas the real highlight in Manchester in terms of new additional listeners is Capital Manchester, earning an additional 100,000 audience reach compared to the same period last year. One of the surprises of the Rajar figures in terms of commercial radio stations in the regions is Yorkshire Coast Radio's ability to remain the largest radio station in terms of percentage reach of its market. Now they're up against tough competition from both national radio stations and other new entries to their market, but to retain 45% of the audience reach within their market, I think is very impressive. We work with clients all the time, and they're very interested in securing BBC local radio coverage. It's worth knowing that as a result of today's Rajar figures, BBC Radio Newcastle is the largest BBC regional radio station outside of London, with 300,000 audience reach. So elsewhere in Yorkshire, there's another couple of bits of bad news. So Viking FM have actually lost about 26,000 audience reach, taking it to a total of about 170,000 weekly reach. And also Dearn FM in Barnsley, they've also lost about 11,000 audience reach, taking it under that 50,000 threshold. Now they've got about 39,000 listeners. In the Midlands, the Free Radio brand that covers specifically Birmingham, the Black Country, they've actually lost figures, whereas the other free radio stations covering other areas in the Midlands, they've actually kind of kept their audience about the same. There is good news though in the East Midlands, because Gem 106, which is now a Bauer-owned radio station, has increased both quarter on quarter and year on year, and they've increased their audience reach about 20,000 over the last year. In the East, KLFM, King's Lynn's finest, has actually increased audience reach by another 3,000 listeners, going up from 66,000 weekly reach to 69,000 weekly listeners. So it's positive news in Northern Ireland, because Downtown and their sister station have both experienced increases in audience reach, while Cool FM, the commercial music brand in Northern Ireland, has increased audience reach again to a 27-year high, with almost approaching 500,000 listeners on a weekly basis. Other positive news in Northern Ireland, because the Q Radio network have increased audience reach and are approaching 300,000 listeners every single week, while BBC Ulster, the BBC radio station that covers that area, are still remaining with more than 500,000 audience every single week. In Wales, Nation Radio has a slight increase in audience reach, up 2,000 listeners from the same period a year ago. Swansea Bay and Dragon also increased audience reach over the same period. Of the global-owned radio stations in Wales, Heart North Wales and Heart South Wales have their figures pretty much static, although Capital North Wales did experience an increase in audience reach. In the south of England, Wave 105 had in the last quarter a record high for them. They've had a slight setback since that record high, but still have consistently high figures, which is great. BBC Swindon and Wiltshire have also experienced an increase in audience reach. They were normally hovering around the kind of 80,000–90,000 audience reach, and they've had a significant increase now because they're now over that 100,000 audience reach. It's easy to see the Rajar figures and get confused by just so much information, and even working in the industry for more than 15 years, sometimes I get a little bit kind of overwhelmed by just how much new figures there are, who's increasing listenership, who's losing listeners. And one of the things that I do as the managing director of the Relations Group and founder of Radio Relations is often host workshops in PR agencies, in large press offices, where we actually show you the changes in the radio industry and how PR professionals can actually exploit those changes to enable clients to deliver their message to their target audience in a credible, editorially justified way to comply with the Ofcom regulations on editorial guidelines and commercial brand mentions. If you'd like us to host a completely free workshop where we come out to your agency or we come out to your press office and just kind of make it customized for you, but making sure that you and your team have the insight, the information and the knowledge to be able to have conversations with your clients about the radio industry, please get in contact with us. And that's radiorelations.co.uk, or just give us a call in the office. It's 0207 158 0000.